Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast on science versus business. I'm Sophia, and joining me today is Mason. How are you today, Mason?
Hey, Sophia, I'm doing great, thanks. I've been looking forward to this conversation. There's a lot to unpack when we talk about science and business, right?
Definitely. It's one of those topics where both sides have their own unique strengths, and sometimes they clash in really interesting ways. But before we dive in, let's give our listeners a quick vocabulary preview. What do you think?
Great idea. Let's set the stage with some key phrases they'll hear us use throughout the episode.
Vocabulary preview.
Vocabulary preview.
Yeah, exactly. Vocabulary preview. So, the first term we'll be discussing is innovation. In both science and business, innovation is crucial. It's about creating new ideas, products, or ways of doing things. Whether you're in a lab or in a boardroom, innovation drives progress.
Exactly. And closely linked to innovation is risk management. This is especially important in business, where companies need to assess the risks of launching new products or entering new markets. But you'll find that scientists deal with risks to think about the risks involved in testing new theories or experiments.
Right. Another key concept is data-driven decisions. This is when you make choices based on hard evidence and numbers, which is common in both fields. Whether you're conducting a scientific study or planning a business strategy, having reliable data is key.
And lastly, we'll talk about scalability. In business, this means being able to grow or expand a product or service efficiently. In science, scalability can also refer to how well a discovery can be applied on a larger scale.
Perfect. So, listeners, keep those terms in mind as we dive into today's discussion. Let's start with a big question. Mason, in your view, what's the core difference between how science and business approach innovation?
That's a great question. I think the main difference comes down to the pace and motivation behind innovation. In science, the goal is often to push the boundaries of what we know, right? It's about discovery, pure and simple. The timeline can be long, sometimes decades, because accuracy and understanding are the priorities.
Yeah, I see that scientists are more concerned with getting things right than with getting things done quickly. But in business, it's almost the opposite sometimes, isn't it?
Exactly. In business, speed is often of the essence. Companies are racing to get their product to market before the competition, or to respond quickly to customer needs. The motivation is often profit or market share, so innovation is about creating something new that can be monetized. It's innovation under pressure.
That's such an interesting point. And I think that pressure can lead to both positive and negative outcomes. On one hand, it drives creativity. On the other hand, sometimes businesses cut corners just to get ahead.
Absolutely. And that's where risk management comes in. In business, you have to be willing to take risks, but they have to be calculated. Launching a new product or investing in a new market can bring huge rewards, but if you don't plan for the risks, it can backfire.
Yeah, and in science, the risks are more about ethics and accuracy. Think about medical research. One mistake could lead to harmful results, so scientists have to be really careful about how they innovate. The stakes are incredibly high, and the risks are different from what businesses face, but they're no less important.
Totally. I think that's where data-driven decisions become essential for both fields. Scientists rely on data to validate their findings. Businesses, on the other hand, use data to make market decisions. Both rely on hard evidence, but in very different contexts.
That reminds me of a real-world example, Tesla. It's a great mix of science and business. Elon Musk's team has to balance scientific innovation, like advancing electric battery technology, with the pressures of the business world. They need to get products to market quickly while still relying on scientific breakthroughs.
Tesla is a perfect example. They're a company that operates right at the intersection of science and business. Every new car they release has to be both scientifically cutting edge and commercially viable. That's not easy.
And they're not just about cars. They've moved into energy storage with their Powerwall batteries, which is another scientific innovation with huge business potential. It's fascinating to see how they merge these two worlds.
You know, Sophia, I've always admired companies like Tesla, but I also think about the human side of innovation. Behind every scientific breakthrough or business decision, there's a person, an inventor, a CEO, a scientist working late nights, pushing their limits.
Yeah, and that takes a toll emotionally and physically. I mean, we often celebrate the final product or the big success story, but we forget about the struggle behind it. The failures, the doubts, the risks they had to take to get there.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that in both science and business, failure is part of the process. Sometimes, failure teaches you more than success ever could.
Speaking of failure, do you remember that time I tried to launch that new product for my company and it completely flopped?
Oh, I remember, but it wasn't a total loss. You learned a ton from it, didn't you?
Yeah, I definitely did. At the time, it felt like the end of the world, but looking back, it was one of the best learning experiences I've had. It's funny how that works, huh?
Yeah, that's the thing about both science and business. Failure is just part of the journey. You have to embrace it and learn from it.
Exactly. And the emotional roller coaster. That's just part of the package. Now we've already talked about the core differences between science and business in terms of innovation, risk, and decision-making. But today we're focusing on something more collaborative, how these two fields can actually work together.
Exactly. And it's not just about how they conflict, but how they can complement each other. It's such an interesting dynamic when you really dig into it.
So let's kick things off with a question I've been thinking about. When you consider companies that combine science and business, like pharmaceutical companies or tech firms, how do you think they balance the priorities of both fields? It must be a constant juggling act, right?
That's a good point. I think it's all about finding harmony between discovery and profit. A company like that has to invest heavily in research and development. Think of all the time, resources, and money poured into scientific research. But at the same time, there's always the pressure to bring products to market, to meet deadlines, and of course, to generate revenue.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where businesses need to rely on strong project management. They need someone who understands both the scientific process and the business side to keep everything moving forward without sacrificing the quality of the research.
Totally. It's almost like they need a translator, a person who can speak both science and business fluently. In fact, I've heard that many tech companies now hire scientific consultants to help bridge that gap. Their role is to ensure the science stays accurate while still making sure the product is viable in the market.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think we've seen that play out in real-world examples like the COVID-19 vaccine development. Scientists were working around the clock to create something that was both safe and effective, while businesses had to ensure the logistics, distribution, and pricing were all in place. It was a massive global effort that required both fields to collaborate closely.
Yeah, and the stakes were incredibly high. The success of that collaboration saved lives, but it also required balancing ethical concerns and business decisions, things like affordability, distribution to lower-income countries, and managing public trust. There's a lot of tension between making a profit and making sure people have access to the medicine.
Right. It's not just about the science or the business, it's about people. The decisions made in these boardrooms and labs affect millions of lives. That's a huge responsibility.
You know, it's interesting how both fields require a certain type of emotional resilience. In business, you deal with the pressure of competition, the risk of failure, and the constant need to stay ahead. In science, you face a different kind of pressure: long hours in the lab, the frustration of experiments not working, and the uncertainty of whether your research will ever lead to anything meaningful.
Yeah, that emotional side is often overlooked. Scientists can spend years working on something that may never see the light of day, while business leaders can see their entire strategy fall apart overnight. It's a tough balance to maintain, but when it works, the results are incredible.
And when it doesn't work, it can be devastating. But that's why collaboration is so important. Neither science nor business can thrive in isolation. They need each other to push boundaries and bring new ideas into the world.
Exactly. When they collaborate, you get the best of both worlds: scientific innovation that's supported by solid business strategies. But it's not easy to maintain that balance. I mean, look at tech startups, for example. They rely on groundbreaking technology, but without the right business model, even the most innovative idea can fail.
That reminds me of a story I heard about a biotech startup. They had this incredible new technology for detecting diseases early, something that could have changed the way we do diagnostics. But they spent too much time in the development phase, and by the time they were ready to launch, a competitor had already beaten them to market.
Oh no, really? What happened after that?
Yeah, it was a tough situation. They were forced to pivot and focus on a smaller niche market. It wasn't what they had initially hoped for, but eventually they found success. It just goes to show that in both science and business, you have to be adaptable.
Adaptability is key. Whether you're working in a lab or running a company, things rarely go exactly as planned. But that's where the learning happens.
You know, I've been thinking about my own experiences in business, and one thing that stands out to me is the importance of communication. Whether you're dealing with investors, customers, or even scientists, being able to communicate clearly is essential. It's not just about having a great idea, it's about making sure people understand and believe in that idea.
Exactly. And communication is just as crucial in science. Scientists often struggle with making their research accessible to the general public or even to business stakeholders. If you can't explain your findings clearly, it's hard to get the funding or support you need to move forward.
And that's where storytelling comes in. I've found that whether you're pitching a product or presenting scientific research, people connect with stories. It's the human element that makes complex ideas relatable.
You're right. I actually had an experience last week where I had to present a new business strategy to our team, and honestly, I was nervous. I spent the entire morning going over my notes, trying to figure out how to make the numbers and projections sound exciting.
That's always the challenge, isn't it? How do you make data sound exciting?
Exactly. But then I realized it's not just about the data, it's about the why. Why is this strategy important? What does it mean for our company and our customers? Once I started focusing on that, the presentation became a lot more natural.
That's a great approach. And it's similar in science. When researchers present their findings, they often start with why the research matters, how it could impact people's lives. It's all about making that human connection.
Well, that brings us to the end of this conversation. As always, it's been a pleasure discussing these ideas with you.
Same here, Sophia. This was such an interesting conversation.
We hope you, our listeners, found this discussion insightful. And as always, stay curious, stay creative, and keep learning.